You know, there are allegations of voter fraud in this race, and the election hasn't even happened yet.
Our next guest is calling for an investigation after newly released evidence shows that more than 900 people, dead people, appeared to have voted in recent elections in South Carolina.
What is the problem with just asking people to have a photo ID?
And now to the Fox News voter fraud unit.
If you watch Fox News, if you read the Drudge Report, then you know there is nothing more terrifying, no greater threat to American democracy than voter fraud. And no one knows this better than Iowa's Republican Secretary of State Matt Schultz, who ran for office in 2011 on the signature issue of stamping out voter fraud in the notoriously corrupt state of, again, Iowa. Still, he made good on his promise, paying Iowa's Division of Criminal Investigation $150,000 to do nothing but root out cases of voter fraud. And after 18 months, guess how many cases of voter fraud turned up? 1,000 cases, you say? Okay, 100. How about 50? 25? Nope. In a state with more than 1.5 million ballots were cast in last year's presidential election, their efforts yielded criminal charges in, wait for it, 16 cases. 16 cases. 5 of those cases have resulted in guilty pleas. 5 others have already been dismissed, and none of the cases have gone to trial. These include such terrifying assaults on democracy, like a woman who cast an absentee ballot for her daughter, which does not seem to constitute voter fraud since the daughter had just moved to Minnesota and the mom thought it was too late for her to register to vote in her new state. This seems to be more of what you might call a misunderstanding. Or the 3 of the 5 guilty pleas that came from felons who just thought their voting rights had been reinstated. But the fact that voter fraud is an absolute miss has always been the case. Whenever researchers have set themselves the task of finding voter fraud, they've failed because, well, it's an astonishing rare phenomenon. But that has not stopped the right from beating the drum on the issue. And that's because they don't really care about stopping voter fraud. They care about stopping people from voting. And in the wake of the Supreme Court's voting rights decision in June gutting the core of the Voting Rights Act, 7 states, largely clustered in the South, which no longer need the federal government's permission to enact their changes to voting laws, have already announced new restrictions on voting, including voter ID laws. And that is why a new piece in the Huffington Post by Bob Kuttner calls for a new organizing campaign modeled on the famous Freedom Rides of the 1960s that helped end segregation, a campaign that would mobilize organizers and citizens to make sure that everyone can vote. Kuttner writes, if the forces of reaction are demanding photo ID cards, let's just go door to door and make sure that every eligible voter gets one. Joining me now, Myrna Perez, Deputy Director of the Brennan Center for Justice, and Reverend Dr. William Barber, President of the North Carolina NAACP. And Reverend, I'll begin with you. You are in a state that has been ground zero for the attack on voting rights, has passed a law that one election law scholar called the most restrictive in the post-voting rights era. What is the next plan, given the fact that the courts probably will not strike anything down in time for the 2014 election? What do you do next, Reverend?
Well, thank you so much, Chris. You know, here in North Carolina, we are in fact headed to court. You know, we just got a date where we'll be actually fighting for an injunction this summer. And across the board in the NAACP, we've really decided that here's what will be our focus. Number one, we will be making our case in court to ensure that these laws are ruled unconstitutional. Number two, we'll be mobilizing everybody to get out and vote, particularly in 2014. Number three, we'll be monitoring all of the attacks that are happening on voting rights because of the denial of Section 5. And then number 4, we will be making every effort to ensure that Section 4 is reinstated so that Section 5 can be implemented. Those are the 4 areas that we have to fight in, we have to push in. You know, this whole voter fraud issue is a fraud, but that's the only thing that the far extreme right can do. They have to create these frauds because they know that their kind of politics cannot win if everybody votes and if people are engaged at the polls. The only way they can win is to stifle the electorate. The only way they can do that is to create a fraud and then enact a fraud, and we have to fight them on every turn.
You know, Myrna, there was a very interesting case of a conversion on the issue of voter fraud that happened recently with Judge Richard Posner. And Judge Posner wrote an opinion in a case, and I should say full disclosure, I know Judge Richard Posner personally, but he wrote an opinion in a very seminal voter ID case that upheld Indiana's voter ID law.
That's right.
Largely on the grounds that it would combat fraud. And he recently gave an interview being like, you know, I've come around on this. I don't think the fraud's there.
Right. No, I mean, I think what's really important is that the common ground be found on a couple of factors. One, everybody believes that only eligible people should vote.
Right. Yeah, I think we're all
on that page.
Right.
And in the course of dealing with the miscreants or the misinformation that people may have that may cause folks to register to vote when they're not eligible, we need to have a response that is measured and appropriate. We cannot have laws or policies that are overbroad, that are too restrictive, that make it too hard for eligible Americans to vote. And one of the problems that we see is that when there are allegations of voter fraud, we have a reaction that is disproportionate to what the science and what the data suggests is actually the problem, and they don't actually target the problem of voter fraud. Instead, they enact these laws and these barriers that are going to make it harder for eligible Americans to participate in our democracy.
In fact, one of the things we've seen reliably in studies of voter fraud is that to the extent that it actually exists, Reverend, to the places we have seen some indications, and again, these are very, very small numbers of cases, in places it does exist is largely in absentee voting, and you don't see, for some reason, absentee voting on the chopping block in states like your own.
That's right. If I understand your question, I heard a little noise in the background, but you're exactly right. What we see happening, for instance, in our state, the Speaker of the House, Tom Tillis, who wants to be a senator, went out of his way, led his extremists to claim there was voter fraud, then had to admit on MSNBC that, in fact, there was no voter fraud. But they created the fear. And once they created the fear, they used that fear to produce a monster voter suppression law. Not just voter ID, they ended same-day registration, cut back early voting, cut back Sunday voting, denied 16 and 17-year-olds from pre-registering. What they do is they use this fraud to create fear, and then they use that fear to do an extreme reduction in voting opportunities, because at the end of the day, injustice always has to have a lie to support it, to create the fear to undergird it, and then they use that to destroy the opportunity for people to vote, because they know if people vote, this narrow-minded extremist agenda cannot pass a public test at the polls.
And it's particularly the case, Myrna, that it is very hard to come up with justification for a whole raft of new restrictions on voting in the absence of some problem you're trying to solve. I mean, no one just, you know, there's limited legislative bandwidth, there's limited time.
There's limited resources.
There's limited resources. I mean, there's a study out of the Brennan Center about how much it's going to cost the state of Missouri to implement their voter ID law. It's not chump change. It's something in the order of about $6 million in the first year.
Well, I mean, and that's what's important to remember, is that even in states that provide free ID or supposedly free ID, it's never really free. Right. First, it costs the states a great deal of money to provide the kind of public education that is needed. And then there's also additional efforts that have to come with creating this brand new ID out of scratch that didn't exist, and all the staffing, and then all the training, and all the training of the poll workers and the election officials. And then for people, they need the underlying documents, which still cost money. They need to take the day off of work to go to the DMV. They need to get themselves there. Many of the DMVs aren't close by or not operating during hours that people are off. And so the thing that I think as Americans we need to ask ourselves is, what kind of barriers are we going to put in front of the ballot box? And on the basis of what evidence, what kind of justification are we going to demand before doing such barriers?
Reverend, given the fact that you're going to have a voter ID law almost certainly in that state, and you know, barring some injunction by a court, is there a grassroots way to get people the identification they need to make sure they will have access to the polls?
Well, in North Carolina, it doesn't even enact until 2016. So whether we have an injunction or not, the voter ID part doesn't go into and play until 2016. What we're trying to do is get people out to the polls in 2014, which can shift who's in our legislature. What we're trying to block the vote is the early registration and the end to same-day registration and Sunday voting, those kinds of things. And what has happened in our state, Chris, is that these people want to hold back the vote, because what they've done in public policy is the one mistake you don't want to ever make, and that's they made everybody mad. They've cut education, teachers are mad, parents are mad. They've cut Medicaid, sick people are mad. They've cut unemployment, unemployed people are mad. The Republicans who say they never raised taxes on 85% of North Carolina. Now taxpayers are mad. Even Republicans are mad. And again, I go back to my point. We must understand that they know that their agenda cannot meet the test of a full voting America. And that's why they're working so hard. So what I say to folks, in 2014, it ought to be mass mobilization and a referendum on this extremism in every state, and particularly throughout throughout the South. We ought to have Freedom Summer at the polls like never before.
Myrna Perez from the Brennan Center for Justice and the one and only Reverend Dr. William Barber from North Carolina NAACP. Thank you both.
Thank you.